most people in this town view the state and a lot of the government programs and taxation programs as aiding minorities and especially blacks. And you're making the argument in your writings for 30, 40 years and in your book that in fact policies like the minimum wage, the expansion of the welfare state have actually been a setback for minorities. How do you defend yourself against your critics?
Well, if you look at the minimum wage, most Americans support the minimum wage and increase in the minimum wage because they have good intentions. They think that, gee, it will help low-skilled people earn higher living. But when you look at public policy, you should not look at the intentions behind public policy. You should ask the question, what are the effects? And you can see the effect of the minimum wage law if you put yourself in the place of an employer. And you say, and you have to pay $7.25 an hour to no matter whom you hire. Well then, would you hire a worker who is so unfortunate so as to have skills that would only enable him to produce $3 or $4 worth of value per hour? Well, most employers will look at that as a losing economic proposition. That is to pay somebody $7.25 when that somebody could only produce $4 worth of value per hour. And so the effect of the minimum wage law is to discriminate against the employment of low-skilled people. And if you look at
wait a minute, those are the people who are going to get the minimum wage.
No, they're not going to get a job in the first place. That is, there's the lowest skilled people, the employer just will not hire them. Now, in the absence of a minimum wage law, if he could pay them $3 or $4 an hour, $5 an hour, well, they could be employed and they would learn something on the job. They get on-the-job training and ultimately be worth $7.25 or even more than that. So what the minimum wage law does, it cuts off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. And if you look for the empirical evidence of this, you just look at our labor force and you see that the unemployment rate among teenagers is the highest. And teenagers are low skilled because they lack the experience, the maturity, and other attributes of adults. And among that group are black teenagers who not only share the handicaps of teenagers in general, but they share the additional handicaps of often going to rotten schools, getting fraudulent education, poor backgrounds, rotten neighborhoods, and early work experiences are very, very important for people who have this kind of background. Now, there's something else about the minimum wage law that nobody considers, and I point that out in a book I wrote in 1989. It's called South Africa's War Against Capitalism. And in that book, I do a study of labor markets in South Africa during its apartheid era. And I give citation after citation of racist unions in South Africa who would never have a black as a member, were the major supporters of minimum wage laws for blacks. And their stated reason was to make the wage high enough so that employers would not hire black workers, they would hire white workers. So it turns out that the minimum wage is the most effective tool in the arsenal of racists everywhere in the world. And let me just give one more example on minimum wage law. The first minimum wage law in our country was the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931. And the Davis-Bacon Act says that all workers in federally funded or federally assisted construction projects must be paid the prevailing wage. And if you look on page 6513 of the Congressional Record on March 31st, 1931, you'll see congressional testimony where congressmen will say, see that contractor over there? He brings cheap colored labor up from the South, puts them in cabins, and it's labor of that sort that has to compete, that white Americans are competing against. It was all kinds of testimony in support of the Davis-Bacon Act that demonstrated that they wanted to keep blacks out of construction. Wow. And see, the tragedy of it is that the Davis-Bacon Act is still on the books today. And another part of the tragedy is that black congressmen, they also support the Davis-Bacon Act. Now, they support the Davis-Bacon Act because unions want the Davis-Bacon Act. Now, the people who support the Davis-Bacon Act today, they just don't use the same rhetoric. They use a more enlightened rhetoric in support of the Davis-Bacon Act. But the minimum wage law, any kind of minimum or any kind of regulation on prices, it discriminates against less preferred people. I mean, if you ask the question, and one example I frequently give talking about setting prices, any kind of price control, it discriminates against less preferred people. I often ask people, suppose you saw a fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking man, and he's married to a beautiful young lady. What kind of prediction would you make about that man's income? You would guess that it's pretty high. And what is he doing? He's telling the beautiful young lady, look, I can't compete for your hand on the basis of a guy like Williams. So I'm going to offset my handicap by offering you a higher price. And so decent people might say, well, gee, is it fair for beautiful young ladies to treat fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking men any differently than they treat handsome men? And they'll say no. And then you make a law saying that beautiful young ladies can't charge fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking men higher prices than they charge handsome men. Then you say, well, then what happens to the probability of a fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking man marrying a beautiful young lady? What you've done by regulating prices, you've taken away his most effective means of competing with the more preferred man by offering higher prices. And so that's the same thing when you regulate any price. You handicap less preferred people.
So if Jesse Jackson were here, or some of the more liberal economists, they would respond to what you're saying by saying, well, look, maybe some people will lose their jobs. But, you know, if you look at the statistics, a disproportionate share of the people who get minimum wage are blacks and Hispanics, minorities. Mm-hmm. And Walter Williams, you are denying these people a pay raise. And then they would ask you, and I want you to respond to this, they'd say, well, Walter Williams, do you want no minimum wage? I mean, should there be no minimum wage that you could pay someone 50 cents a dollar? You're just going to drive those wages down to the least common denominator.
Well, first of all, that would be untrue, but I would answer the question, yeah, I would want no minimum wage, because what the minimum wage law does, I believe in people's right to contract and be able to engage in peaceable voluntary exchange at mutually beneficial or mutually agreeable terms. And the minimum wage law interferes with that. And matter of fact, the courts for a long time in the United States held that same position, that the minimum wage law violated the right of contract. And you look at the Children's Hospital versus Atkins case, and where the court said that it violated the freedom of contract. And it wasn't until the 1938, I believe, is West Coast Hotel versus Parish, I believe. That's the case where the court eventually said, well, gee, the minimum wage law is constitutional. But however, they were under threat of Roosevelt packing the court, so it was they say sometimes the switch in time that saved none.
Right.
And so I believe that people have the right to negotiate. And then also a lot of people say the minimum wage law is an anti-poverty device. It reduces poverty. Well, that doesn't even pass the smell test. I mean, because if it were an anti-poverty device, rather than our spending all these millions and billions of dollars in foreign aid, we just tell Bangladesh and Haiti, you could be rich like we are, just have a higher minimum wage. That's just utter nonsense. And then also, the empirical evidence on the minimum wage law, in 1948, the unemployment rate among black teenagers was 9.4%.
1948.
1948. The unemployment rate among white teenagers was like 10.2.
So it's lower.
It was lower.
Lower for blacks than whites.
Yeah, and the labor force participation rates for black teenagers were greater than white teenagers. Matter of fact, it was 106%. And so you say, well, how come in 1948? Was there less discrimination? Is that why? Or were blacks more in 1948 higher skilled than whites? No, it was the minimum wage law.